Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the absolute roller coaster that is the rise and fall of Conor McGregor. We're looking at a story that goes way beyond just fighting inside a steel cage. It's this incredibly fascinating look at how unshakable confidence, when you actually back it up with action, can completely alter the landscape of mainstream entertainment. But, as we'll see, it's also a stark look at how the massive weight of that success can create some pretty unbelievable challenges.
I mean, just imagine for a second, an athlete so profoundly dangerous that they don't just confidently predict they're going to knock you out, they actually go in there and do exactly that. It wasn't just talk, right? It was this terrifying reality that made world champions literally doubt themselves before they even stepped foot in the cage. He reached the absolute pinnacle of the fighting world faster than anyone thought was humanly possible, only to watch things slowly and very publicly fall apart. By the end of our explainer today, you're going to understand exactly why his rise was so magical and why his fall shocked the entire world.
Now, what's literally mind-blowing about his origins is the massive contrast here. Back in the early 2010s, he started as a young guy from Dublin, Ireland with barely a penny to his name, and yet he walked around with this level of self-belief that most people honestly just called pure delusion. While other up-and-comers were just hoping to make a living fighting, Conor was talking like his massive success was already a done deal. He didn't just want to win a few fights, he wanted to completely take over the sport. He truly believed he was destined for greatness long before he had any tangible proof to show anyone.
Part 1. The Delusional Dreamer, a rise from nowhere. Let's trace this absolute rocket ship of an ascent from the gritty regional scenes all the way up to the blinding lights of the UFC.
So, as he's tearing through the regional scene, people just couldn't help but pay attention. His striking, the way he moved, it simply looked completely different from anyone else out there. He snags 2 championship belts outside the UFC, and suddenly, he catches the eye of the world's biggest MMA organization. This was it. This was the exact opportunity he'd been waiting for, the biggest stage and the absolute toughest competition on the planet.
And wow, his UFC debut? Absolutely explosive. He goes out, destroys Marcus Brimage in the very first round, and then he grabs the mic. Now, instead of your standard, polite introduction, he drops this chilling prophecy. He says, "We're not here to take part, we're here to take over." Most fighters introduce themselves by just raising their hand, but Conor? He introduced himself with a massive statement. And at first, sure, it sounded like your typical fight hype. But then, he just kept winning.
Moving on to Part 2, Psychological Warfare, breaking opponents early. Because he wasn't just winning physically, he fundamentally mastered the mental game.
His formula here was honestly brilliant. What made him so terrifying wasn't just that lethal left hand. He figured out that if he controlled the headlines, he controlled the narrative, and through that, he controlled the entire spotlight. Long before the cage door actually locked, his opponents were already exhausted from fighting him mentally. Future legends like Max Holloway and Dustin Poirier, they got completely sucked into this trap. When he fought Poirier the first time, Conor convinced everyone in the building he was going to win, and he used that immense psychological pressure to force Dustin to fight emotionally. The result? A lightning-fast knockout.
So as the wins are piling up, everyone is screaming for him to get an immediate title shot. But the UFC throws him a bit of a curveball. They match him up against Dennis Siver, which confused a lot of people, because Siver wasn't really viewed as a serious threat to Conor. But did Conor lose focus? No way. He used the fight as a stunning, primetime showcase. He utterly dominated the guy from start to finish, and the very second the fight ended, he instantly turned all his attention straight to the ultimate prize.
Which brings us to Part 3, the Undisputed King, the Aldo and Alvarez era. This is the breathtaking peak of his career, and it kicked off with a massive, globe-trotting promotional campaign against the man who had basically ruled the division forever.
The hype for this one was off the charts. It became one of the most famous promotional campaigns in combat sports history. We're talking wild press conferences, world tours, and just endless, relentless trash talk that turned a fight into a massive global event. And look, a lot of people believe that Jose Aldo, who wasn't just the champ, but widely considered one of the greatest featherweights to ever live, was going to be the impenetrable brick wall that finally stopped the McGregor hype train.
13 seconds. That is literally all it took. 13 seconds. One perfectly timed step-back counterpunch changed absolutely everything. Jose Aldo faceplants, the crowd goes totally ballistic, and history is made. In less time than it takes to tie your shoes, Conor McGregor captured the featherweight championship of the world and officially transformed from a rising star into a true global phenomenon.
But you know how it goes, right? Success creates a whole new problem. Once you achieve an impossible dream, you immediately start hunting for the next one. Never satisfied with just one belt, he set his sights on Eddie Alvarez, the lightweight champion.
In a fight where a lot of critics thought he'd face some serious trouble, he instead put on an absolute masterclass. He dropped Alvarez over and over again, controlled the action flawlessly from beginning to end, and captured that second belt. That image of him sitting on top of the cage, a championship belt on each shoulder, it instantly became one of the most iconic images in UFC history. Part 4. Cracks in the armor. The aura shifts. Because right at that exact moment, he seemed entirely untouchable. But as we know, getting to the mountaintop is incredibly hard. Staying there might actually be impossible.
And here's where we start to see a pretty rapid downward spiral. First, there was this massive shocker, a loss to Nate Diaz. Diaz was a short-notice replacement who just flat out wasn't intimidated by the hype or the mind games, and he handed Conor his very first UFC defeat. Not to his credit, Conor demanded an immediate rematch and gutted out a grueling 5-round victory that proved he could bleed and struggle and still win. But then came Khabib Nurmagomedov. This was a dark, intensely personal feud, a true clash of worlds. And inside the cage, Khabib completely dragged Conor into deep waters, exposed his grappling weaknesses, and handed him a decisive, punishing defeat. The unstoppable force had finally been stopped.
Which leads us to Part 5, the brutal downfall, time away, and tragic returns. Even though his money and his fame only kept skyrocketing after the Khabib loss, that invincible aura, it was gone. Turns out, staying at the top is a whole lot harder than getting there. Years started passing between his fights, and the MMA community started asking some really serious questions. Was the hunger still there? How could you be motivated to get punched in the face when you're sleeping in silk sheets, right? Now, he did have a brief, overwhelming return in 2020 where he knocked out Donald Cerrone in seconds. That gave fans a flicker of hope that the old Conor was back. But his long hiatuses kept those persistent questions alive and well.
Then, Dustin Poirier steps back into the picture. The sport had fundamentally evolved during Conor's time away, and Dustin had evolved right along with it. In a truly shocking turn of events, the same guy Conor once easily knocked out in 90 seconds back in 2014 came out in their 2021 rematch and used these devastating modern calf kicks to just chop Conor's leg to pieces. He eventually handed Conor a bitter, brutal knockout defeat. After that, a trilogy fight was absolutely inevitable.
And let me tell you, that third fight carried enormous pressure. All the mutual respect we saw in the second fight was completely gone. It was replaced by this deep, ugly hostility. But nobody, and I mean nobody, expected the ending we got. It didn't conclude with a legendary comeback or a clean knockout. Instead, it ended with one of the most shocking, gruesome injuries in UFC history. A horrific lower leg break that instantly ended the fight, and forced Conor to step away from competition yet again.
Finally, Part 6, a complicated legacy. What remains? Let's take a step back and really reflect on what this incredibly dramatic, Icarus-like rise and fall actually means for his place in history.
Looking at this breakdown, we're left with this incredibly stark, dual legacy. On one hand, he is the undeniable superstar who objectively changed combat sports forever. He became the first double champ, broke pay-per-view records, and inspired literally millions of people by showing exactly what supreme, backed-up confidence can achieve. But juxtaposed against all that magic is a fighter marked by long hiatuses who eventually found his greatest opponent in himself. It just goes to show, sometimes the biggest battles a person fights aren't inside a cage. They're fought within. So we're going to leave you with this final thought to ponder about the most fascinating career that the sport has ever produced. If he fights again, can he return and write one final legendary chapter? Could he actually pull off the greatest comeback in MMA history? Or have we already witnessed the last great chapter of his story? Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.